Thank you so much for joining us today in our 55th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online, and this afternoon you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned during today's broadcast. In addition, I'm happy to report that previous episodes of the Bookworm are now available on the Clements Library YouTube channel. So check those out and tell all of your friends. If you are joining us for the first time, I want to mention that we love to have everyone use the chat, and we think of this as a community program. So please feel free to chime in and change the setting to everyone. However, if you have questions for our panelists, please put those in the Q&A section so that we'll keep them together. You can also see the questions that other people are asking, and if it's a question you have, you can give it a thumbs up to upvote it, and that will help order the questions so we see what people most want to discuss. As part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, we have the live machine captions turned on. You can change the size, you can toggle that on or off and move it around your screen. So play around with that so that it's as useful to you as you would like it to be. And we also have side-by-side mode enabled so that you can see the speakers and the slides. So play around with what your screen looks like so that you can see everything. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to 1900. I also want to take a moment for land acknowledgement, and the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the single largest land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that has allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, if you haven't participated in the poll yet, it's your last chance to click very quickly. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And we thought this would be fun given the topics that we're discussing today, just to get a sense for, what the audience knows about astrology and astronomy. And as we were discussing earlier, it seems that most people know their astrological sign. 89% of you mentioned that, but only 3% consult your daily horoscope. However, we do find it fun to read the horoscope from time to time. I know that I hadn't looked at mine in a long time, and so Googling it this morning was indeed fun. The CoStar app is something that has a lot of popularity right now, but only 3 people in our audience have downloaded that app. And 61% know the phases of the moon and can locate some key star formations in the night sky. So it'll be fun for everyone to think about your base of knowledge as we hear more from Carrie and Trent during today's program. close that. Today's episode is generously sponsored by Marianne and Richard Reinhardt. So thank you so much for your participation and your belief in this program and your generosity. So today's episode of the Clements Bookworm is a fellow focus, and I'm really delighted to introduce today's panelists. Trent MacNamara is Assistant Professor of History at Texas A&M University. He specializes in 19th and early 20th century U.S. cultural, intellectual, and social history. His first book, Birth Control and American Modernity, A History of Popular Ideas, explores how family limitation became popular and legitimate among ordinary Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries. MacNamara is now working on a second book project, which explores Americans' changing ideas about the material and spiritual contents of the sky. He was awarded the Mary G. Stang Fellowship at the Clements Library. I'm also delighted to welcome Carrie Bramen, who is a professor of English at the University of Buffalo and just completed a 6-year term as director of the university's Gender Institute. She is the author of 2 books, American Niceness, A Cultural History, and The Uses of Variety, Modern Americanism and the Quest for National Distinctiveness. She has also written for The Washington Post, The Conversation, Black Agenda Report, Political Theology Network, and Times Higher Education. Next spring, she will be a fellow in residence at the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford University. She is currently working on a book entitled The Journey Work of the Stars, A Cultural History of Astrology in the American 19th Century. She came to the Clements as a Norton Strange Townsend Fellow. Professors MacNamara and Bramen will be in conversation with Clements Librarian for Instruction and Engagement, Maggie Vanderford, who oversees our Visiting Research Fellowship program. Maggie had the chance to get to know Trent and Carrie while they were researching on site, and I'm delighted to turn it over to her now to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you, Carrie and Trent, for spending time with us this morning. Both Carrie and Trent were visiting research fellows at the Clements, working on projects that are very much inspired by and deal with a similar kind of synergy, but they were at the library at different times. So we really wanted the conversation this morning to feel like a natural extension of the in-person tea time that happens at the library when fellows come to visit, which begins with a presentation by the fellows to the staff, followed by a period of Q&A and really sort of casual discussion about the project, the sources that fellows are looking at while they're at the library, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to start today in the same way and ask both Trent and Carrie just to give a brief overview of their book projects. You both visited the library last year to conduct research for your in-progress book manuscripts. So could you share a little bit about the scope and the purpose of your project, and also what types of sources you were looking at the Clements in support of it? I'll ask Trent to go ahead and start us off.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Maggie and Angela. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So as Angela said, my project is essentially a history of popular cosmology in the US since the 1790s. So I'm looking at how non-intellectuals assessed the content and meaning of the heavens between roughly 1800 and roughly 1970. My central guiding question at the Clements and elsewhere was what do people with no special education or authority think is important about the space above their heads, and how has that changed? So there's there's no book on this topic. I'm not revising somebody else. I'm kind of doing it from whole cloth. There is a big and rich history of cosmology in general, but that history focuses essentially exclusively on the big name astronomers and theorists. So it's the story of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and their various interpreters within the churches and outside the churches and scientific networks. So that history tells a story where those astronomers and their popularizers decenter the Earth and introduce us to a totally new cosmos. And the inference is that that process must have had some major effect on ordinary people, not just on other scientists. And I find that conclusion to be correct, but it also is a little bit misleading because it doesn't tell us anything about how that happened for ordinary people. And oftentimes the picture from below is not the picture from the sort of elite scientific network. So I'm looking at kind of not just was it important, but how was it important to a farmer or a washerwoman or somebody who's illiterate or enslaved and so on. Finding sources on this topic has been no cakewalk because the sources are typically organized around the person, like the Newton figure. And when the sources are from the farmer figure, first of all, those sources are often scarce. But second, they're not organized around this person's thoughts about the heavens. So you kind of have to just kind of go through every haystack instead of digging through one haystack around the astronomer, whoever it may be. So that's where the Clements comes in. And I'll come back to the sources I found there in a minute. But first, just sort of the basic narrative, the story that I tell. And I should say that I'm roughly halfway through my book. So this is better informed for the 1790s to 1880s or so than after that. But basically, I have sort of a baseline in circa 1800 when the heavens are the sort of universal literacy in celestial things of all kinds. The sky is of everyday relevance to almost all people in a way that it's mostly not today. It's a very intimate space. It's animate. It's highly moralized. It's something that people just encounter more often. They're more likely to be outside. They're unlikely to have any kind of light pollution. They have fewer distractions for their eyes, like, for example, even cheap newspapers. And then maybe most important for these people, many of life's most important contingencies have everything to do with the heavens. So that's, it's health, which is governed by the stars, as Carrie may discuss. It's weather, which of course both physically comes from the sky, and which you can predict in the sky through astrology. And then of course it's eternal salvation. So the sky, both determines your fate in a very physical way, also in a metaphysical way, and also can foretell your fate when you read the stars and celestial bodies. So I also find that, at this time, people assume different things about the religious content of the heavens. So it's much more likely at this time on a proportional basis to have people assume, without really thinking about it or having to defend it, that God is a sort of man-like, watchful being who lives close to us in a kingdom which is more or less Earth-like, sort of Earth but better. And crucially, I find that the sky is important to people because it's open to all. So unlike a church or a scientific network, the sky is equally accessible to all of us in a spiritual way. It's equally inaccessible to all of us in a physical way. If you live in 1800, it has no human masters. And in that way, it could sort of shrink the local tyrant in your life, your landlord or your boss or your driver, whoever it may be, whatever power they may have on earth, they have no better access to power in heaven than you do. So the narrative from there, by the mid-19th century, I start to find considerable evidence that this sky world is of less day-to-day relevance to people than it had been a few decades earlier. Through the process of the spread, especially of cheap print and mass education, people just seem to assume that less of what makes a good life has to do with the heavens and more with humans and human institutions. So it's just more of like a 2D conception of what really matters in life. So I chart this in terms of the transition of the old heavens to the newer space. The heavens have been being more intimate, animate, moral, and the new space being more, generally speaking, sterile, centerless, vast beyond comprehension. So of course, the old heavens survive in many ways. They survive through a new kind of sort of conscious biblical literalism, through civil religion, the kind of linking of the country to a sort of higher, quote unquote, destiny in the heavens, through the new astrology, and so on. So I've used lots of sources to sort of track this development over time. Hymns, popular arts, funeral sermons, all kinds of cheap print, like memoirs and visionary notebooks and school texts and so on. I'll show a few here of the sorts of sources I've used. This is a so-called hieroglyphic Bible from the 1780s, which gives you a good sense of the sort of intense, not just celestial, but visual content that people linked with the sort of idea of higher destinies, higher ideas. They had a space in the literal higher sphere of the cosmos. This is a school textbook from the 1850s, which gives you a very different sort of visual on what's in space and what's important about it. Again, here, that's an image from the same textbook where we're sort of, adrift in a darker and more mechanical space. And then on the right there, a still from a novel, kind of early sci-fi novel from the 19th century, where Earth is similarly adrift and small. On the left here, we have an example of the civil religion of the heavens. That's George Washington escorting a apparently grateful Abraham Lincoln into heaven. And then, of course, eventually you have aviation with the perfection of balloons in the 19th century, and then controlled flight in the 20th century. It's a big theme that I look at as the book moves forward. On the left here, you have a cartoon about the sort of physical overshadowing of heavenly things by urban life, which of course produces light pollution, but also produces like physically larger buildings that block out the sky, and produces indoor occupations where people just are not outside as much. On the right here, this is from the 1904 St. Louis Fair, where you have religious themes sort of buried amongst other attractions on the midway. So this is I'm going to look at just a couple of Clements sources here as I wrap up. This is from Elias Loomis, who was a professor and lecturer on astronomy in the early 19th century. This is one of many excellent sources I found at the Clements. I told Maggie that I use this system of 3 stars, like asterisks, to denote really valuable stuff that I cannot leave out of the book. And in the 65-ish pages of single-spaced notes that I took at the Clements last summer, there are, I counted 102 of these 3-star, which is like, for me, that is ultra high density. So it was a useful trip just a couple of examples here that I wrote down. I found a letter from a semi-literate farmer from Georgia who wanted to convert to Swedenborgianism, where he describes heaven, its trees, but even the leaves of its trees, its rivers, its sapphires. I found the so-called the Henry Murphy letter book from the 1850s also, which contains 7 letters from Murphy's deceased sister in heaven, which were relayed to Henry Murphy by a sort of semi-educated spirit medium by the name of Judd Pardee, and include an account of his sister's visit to Saturn. So again, she's in heaven, but she's in like a kind of nearby astronomical location. And then finally, my favorite source from the Clements is, this is a little snippet of it. It's a long handwritten vision memoir by a farmer and woodcutter from upstate New York named Thomas Davenport, who goes to heaven. He's on a stump having cut a tree in the 1820s, and goes into a trance, travels to heaven, and comes back with a report of a circular celestial city, which he diagrams here, which is 1,500 miles long or wide. He says, quote, "You have said," he's talking to kind of his adversaries, people who are taking a more modern look at the heavens. "You have said it was a vain thing to serve the Lord, and that it is more than 95 million miles to heaven. And how could you get faith from heaven to ask for the things that you need if it is so? But," he says, "I've been to heaven. I've seen its walls, its golden streets, its central transparent throne on which both God and Jesus sit." So it's had a sort of an answer to the transformation of the heavens. Oh, this is a final thing. So it happens that in the reading room when I was at the Clements, there were 2 globes, the first American globes ever made in the 1810s. This is really interesting to me because there were 2, one terrestrial and one celestial. And it was interesting to me that the America's first commercial globe maker would assume that what you want when you buy a globe is a set, one of which contains the heavens and one of which contains the earth. Of course, nowadays when we buy a globe, we automatically assume it's a terrestrial globe. So it's a good analogy for me of how the world has become kind of more two-dimensional, more like arrayed along the surface of the earth, as opposed to having this kind of constantly relevant third dimension above us. So thanks a lot. That's my project.
Trent, it's such a great project. I truly cannot wait for that book to come out. So thank you for talking us through that. And I have more questions for you that we will certainly dive into later. But Carrie, I'd like to turn it over to you to hear a little bit about your project. And I think you have some images to share also.
Yeah, great sources, Trent. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, looks good.
So I'm currently working on a cultural history of astrology in the 19th century United States, and there's not much written on the topic. I highly recommend The History of Astrology by Nick Campion. He's not focused on the US, but he basically claims that the 19th century was a nadir of astrological thought until you get to the Theosophists of the 1870s and 1880s. Think of Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant and others. And that's when modern astrology starts taking its contemporary form. But I wanted to sort of dig deeper, and I wanted to complicate this narrative to say, well, what else is happening in the 19th century in terms of astrological thought? And so this is my 3rd book about the 19th century United States, and it's my first book that is almost reliant on the archive, entirely reliant on the archive, and finding amazing discoveries through the serendipitous search that Trent was describing as well, which is such a pleasure of the archive. So I went to Clements with 2 things in mind. One, to check out the almanacs. At the New York Public Library, I had looked at British almanacs like Zadkill, which is absolutely fabulous, and I can talk about it. It's outrageous in terms of his predictions. But I wanted to look at US almanacs in particular. And here's an example of one called the Moral Almanac from Philadelphia in 1845. And as you can see, it really assumes a great deal of astroliteracy from its readers. And what do I mean by astroliteracy? And I define that phrase is the ordinary understanding of astrological glyphs, of moon signs, etc., lunation phases that were part of everyday knowledge in the 19th century. And almanacs, as has been argued, really came from an agricultural society. Sort of moon farming, when to plant, when to harvest, was all determined by lunation phases. So what we see in the 19th century is this practice of an agricultural society and the forms of sophisticated literacy that comes from that. So what we see here, this is a page from 1845, and I love the fact that it has the different regions, and Cincinnati would have been in the hinterland at that period. And just as an aside, Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in Cincinnati in 1845. So I love the idea of having her sort of browse through the Moral Almanac to see when the tides were going to happen, although I don't think she would have had to worry about that. But as you can see on the far right, it has the astrological glyphs. So this assumes that a printmaker, for instance, would have understood that, all right, I need the Scorpio glyph here for January 4th. That's where the moon is located. And so you can sort of see in the columns, the third column to the left points out that Mars conjuncts the moon on the 4th of January. So it just gives you a sense of how common this sort of knowledge was, and it is a form of reading. I really do think that this is a demonstration of literacy. And so I want to just sort of go on here to the Southern Almanac. This is the first Confederate era almanac that I've had a chance to see at the Clements Library. It's produced 1864, Lynchburg, Virginia. I didn't want to open the pages too much because the binding was quite fragile. And so I took an angled photo and you can sort of see it's quite fascinating, actually. You have the date, so you have a reference to historical battles. You have the Battle of Chancellorsville and the date of that, 63. The death of General T.J. Jackson died a week later, 63. So even though this is 1864, what you see is a kind of historical documentation of the battles of the Civil War, interspersed with new moon on the 21st. So you have the earthly and the planetary intermingled on the pages of this almanac of historical fact and astrological time and astronomical time. And I just was sort of riffing on this because I'm an English professor and I want to sort of think about what this sort of means. And for me, I just see sort of the steadiness, the rhythmic predictability of the moon phases, juxtaposed against the unpredictability of war and conflict. And so it's all kind of documented on this single page. So the second reason why I wanted to go to the Clements was to check out the papers of a doctor, Dr. George Bill. And he was born February 25th, 1855 in Massachusetts. He attended Tufts and then Harvard Medical School, graduated in 1880. He was a gynecologist, but it seems like he mainly focused on women's hysteria and neurasthenia. He was also a Freemason, and he was an astrologer. He studied astrology. I won't say he's an astrologer. He studied it from 1890 to 1893. He worked with his tutor by the name of Carl Anderson. And it's part of a correspondence class through the mail where Carl Anderson sends him different assignments and different lessons to teach him how to read astrological nativities. So this document was in his file. It is the nativity, the hand calculated. This is before apps, it's before calculators. So he used an ephemeris. He was about 1 degree off. I checked it on the app. He was very close, but 1 degree off in his calculations. And what this is, it's a nativity done for Dr. Bill. And it was a cherished document. You can tell because it was in pristine shape. So it's something that he had, that he carried with him, and that his son donated to Clements Library. But I just wanted to point out some of the things here. You can see that this is a business by Carl Anderson. This is what would be a carbon copy. So you have amount paid, amount due on the right. And then you have his insignia, Chaldean, Arabic. So he practices an older form, an ancient form of astrology. As you can also point out, there's no Pluto because Pluto's not discovered until 1930. Uranus is there in the 6th house. For those of you who can read this chart, there's no Neptune though. Neptune was discovered in 1846, and there's no inclusion of it in this chart. But he's basically focusing on the 7 traditional planets. And what is so interesting about this, and why I see it as going into a more traditional form of astrology, is that there's evil degrees, there's evil planets. Saturn and Mars are the great malefics, and Venus is a benefic. There are good degrees of planets and evil degrees, and he actually uses the language of evil. And so this is really going back to ancient tradition, Egyptian, Mesopotamian. And right now, what's so interesting is that there's a return to that. There's a huge debate in astrological circles. Do you focus on the more psychological astrology of the 20th century, or do you go back to this older method? So it's interesting that he's already practicing this, although he's toning down the predictiveness of it, the language of prediction here. And part of the reason why, and I suspect, is anti-fortune telling laws really went after astrologers who tried to predict the future. All right, so that is toned down here. What is amusing about it, in the second page, which I did not include in my slideshow, he advises Dr. Bill to move, not to have an office or a home near books. So no schools, no libraries, no restaurants for some reason, and no cornfields. All right. Well, within 2 years, Dr. Bill moves to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I've never understood why, by going through his papers, why he got up and left, but I'm wondering if it's because of that document and that kind of assessment by Carl Anderson that he really should move. And as soon as he dies, his wife goes back to Boston. All right, and his funeral is in Boston. So it's sort of something I couldn't explain, and maybe that explains why he got up and left. This was also in the papers. It's Carl Anderson. It's a lesson that was sent to Dr. Bill. And it's the astrology of disaster. And this has to do with a tragic fire that took place at an insane asylum in Montreal, Canada on May 6th, 1890. And so what Carl Anderson does is try to understand the astrology of that event. Why did it happen? So astrology here is providing a kind of explanatory map of causality. All right. And it says basically this, and I'll summarize it for you. It's Saturn, which is, we know, a malefic, is right on the ascendant, which is the line of life, the point of birth, of the new day, of the sunrise. So you have a malefic there in Leo, a fire sign. And he goes on to say that Mars, the second malefic, is also in the fire sign of Sagittarius. That is right on the IC, the cusp of the 4th house, for those of you who can read charts. So he said, no wonder there's a fire. You have, these 2 signs of fire signs, malefics, happening right at key angles of the chart. So you can see that he's explaining it through an astro reading. But what's really interesting for me in this is that astrology was used not just as prophecy, as prediction, but a way to analyze history, all right, to make sense of the recent past. It's also a pedagogical tool, all right, for teaching students how to map a moment. But I also wanted to point out the word disaster. The word disaster etymologically comes from aster, being removed from a star, to be disconnected from the star, so no longer guided. I mean, really literally means misguided. And so even in the word disaster, there is this kind of astrological resonance in the very history of the term, which I think shapes this tragic fire. Going to the next slide, I was really curious who Carl Anderson was, because Dr. Bill gets these letters from his tutor in the mail, saves everyone, and he signs it Carl in quotes. So you don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to realize Carl must be a pseudonym. So I looked and looked in Clements, nothing. I assumed he was in Boston. No. It wasn't until I went through the historical newspapers database that I came across his obituary, and he was outed in the obituary as Captain Charles Homans. He was born in Boston and he died in Brooklyn in 1901. Carl Anderson wrote the book, The Astrology of the Old Testament, in 1892. It was highly respected, supposedly, at least that's what his family wrote in the obituary. It was taught at Tufts and at Harvard. There's also a chapter on Lizzie Borden in there. So I'm not sure how much of it sticks to the Old Testament. Maybe that legitimates it and gives it some respectability. But what's interesting is that he was a diplomat, and he worked for the US consul in Suriname. He traveled throughout Latin America. He was fluent in Spanish, and he was a Union Army veteran. So I want to do more work on him, but it's very difficult. I'm going to have to sort of look through the archives through his actual name and see what else I can learn. So that's basically it. And sort of I left Clements intrigued by the history of diplomats and military personnel and doctors and people of respectability who are basically practicing astrology on the down low. And there's a story to be told there. So.
Oh, I love that so much. And Carrie, you and I have talked about sort of the effect of that serendipity in the reading room, that you will open something up and just have no idea that it will take you in a fascinating and exciting direction. So that's one of my favorite serendipity stories. What I think is really interesting about both of your projects is that they're both attempting to fill in some gap in what we understand to be this 19th century story of how humans are negotiating relationships with their environment. Carrie, in your project, for example, you are really clear that in the pre-theosophy historical narrative, astrology is still really under-theorized. And Trent, in your project, you sort of note that there's a real absence of writing about how non-elite Americans understood new cosmology. These both sort of absences in the record right now. My question for you is, why do you think these gaps exist? And the short answer, or I guess the way that I think of this question in my head is, why don't your books exist yet? And what challenges have you encountered in sort of seeking out the answers to your big questions that might help clarify some of that? So if we could start with Carrie, that would be great.
Yeah, I think the reason why there isn't a history of astrology in the United States is because it's below the radar. People haven't really cared, and it's not respectable, right? And I have the license now to do that. This is my third book. So I can really much choose what I want to do. And I've always had an interest in astrology. And I just think the archive contains these stories that I just found at the Clements. And I think there's many more of these stories around. And I think it's potentially really fascinating because historians have focused on the Theosophists because there's so much that they wrote. It's really easy to find them. All right. They documented everything. And so I'm interested in those who didn't document everything, or maybe just kept their nativity in the desk drawer and, wrote some letters about it. So I'm interested in the forgotten and maybe the forbidden history of astrology as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Trent. What about you?
So I think the maybe the overwhelming answer to this is just practical. It's, as I said, it's the sources are not organized around popular accounts of cosmology. And while the best sources that I've found have all been on paper in archives, including at the Clements, I don't think I would have undertaken this project if I didn't think I'd be able to find a lot of stuff through digital sources, where I can, for example, go through a 300-page memoir and find the one paragraph that gives hints as to somebody's assumptions about cosmology. That's made the project, I think, workable in like a less than 30-year time horizon.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The book has to be finished at some point. I also am curious for both of you. The projects are both ones that deal with the history of religion in different ways. They're not necessarily religious history projects, but religion, whether you're thinking of that as institutional religion or belief systems more generally, is important to your projects, but in totally different ways. So how do the stories you're telling grapple with religious history in whatever that means to you? And I know that's a big and complicated question, but would love to hear your take on it. So let's go ahead and start with Trent, if we can.
Okay, sorry, my internet may not be stable, but I'll do my best here. So your question's about how my project intersects with the idea of religion. I think I was tempted to use the term supernaturalism, which others have used, but I'm always a little wary to get too bogged down in definitional writing. So I use religion. I think part of what's interesting about my project from that perspective is that there's this assumption in American history that goes way back to kind of early Protestant ideals that what's important about religion, and by extension, what we should study as historians, consists of ideals. So it's not about the physical world, and some Catholic historians have pushed back against this, saying, physical things can be important to practical religiosity. And they've created a literature about so-called material Christianity. And what I'm kind of trying to do is take material Christianity into the natural world and into physically higher places, and see look at the sky as kind of like a very different kind of material space. It's both plainly visible and also spiritually transcendent in the culture at large. So I think in general, people have treated the sky as being kind of like neither here nor there, because it's neither like a plainly material thing, nor is it like a plainly spiritual thing. But I think in popular cosmology, it's not at all like, it's not a question of being neither here nor there. It's a question of having both those qualities at the same time, and therefore in some ways kind of having more power, of being both transcendent and visible and apparent, and not requiring any kind of a priori belief in dogma.
Yeah, absolutely. Carrie, what about you?
I think in the US context, astrology has been seen as the extension of divinity, that this is God's language. This is the way in which he communicates with us on earth. And so to decipher the nativity is itself a sacred act. And that has been consistent. Tomlin writes about it in terms of the Puritans. Cotton Mather, sort of says we shouldn't be doing astrology, and then it launches into a close reading of an astrological chart of a fellow minister. So Cotton Mather understood how to read the nativity. And so there isn't that big of much tension, I don't think, so far. And this actually goes back to my American Niceness book. And I wish I was also still able to write a chapter for that, because American astrologers are really nice. I mean, I didn't mention this, but Kurt Anderson says about Dr. Bill, you'll live in old age and you'll die rich. All right. If we look at British astrologers of the 19th century, they're much more into what's called judicial astrology, which is predictive. So Zadkill's best-selling almanac predicted accurately that Prince Albert would die in 1861. All right. And that was sort of headlines all over. Oh my God, Zadkiel, how did he predict this? So I think the British were much more edgier in their predictions, and they absolutely countered that limit point of, are you trespassing what we ought to know? Where Americans, at least what I found so far, are pretty tame in comparison, at least in the 19th century.
Oh, that's amazing. I think I want the nice predictions, frankly. That sounds great to me. I'm going to throw one last question at you, and then we'll open it up for everyone else's questions. And actually, I'd also be curious to know what questions you have for each other, which I don't think we've asked yet. I know this is the first time you're actually really able to sit down together in conversation about your book projects. So we'll make some time and space for that at the end too. But before we wrap up, without dipping our toes into the stream of presentism, for someone who's trying to understand the very real question of how the 19th century laid foundations for today's cultural attitudes towards the skies or astrology or cosmology, what do your books tell them? What do they tell us about American culture in the present moment? And again, while trying not to read ourselves completely into the past, it is difficult not to see this wave of popular attention towards apps like CoStar or fixations with trying to understand the skies in a really sort of incredible way as something that hasn't been building up since the 19th century in various forms. So Carrie, let's start with you. I think this is really directly applicable to your project and a question that I'm sure you've thought about a lot.
Absolutely. Astrology right now is immensely popular, whether it's through apps, whether it's through books, whether it's through online classes. People are acquiring a really sophisticated knowledge about it because it's accessible. And, CoStar, 25% of American women between the ages of 18 and 25 have CoStar on their phone, 25% of American women. So that's an enormous, it's one of 100 top best-selling apps. And it's the only astrology app in that top 100 list. So this is about popular culture as well. And for me as an English professor, I'm wondering where all the readers have gone, because there's fewer and fewer students in our literature classes, and yet young people are still reading. But I think they're reading texts that are not conventionally the novel or poetry. And it's interesting, CoStar hires 2 full-time poets to write their daily horoscopes. So I just think that as an English professor, I'm interested in different modalities of reading and what are the popular texts and the forms of literacy being employed today.
Perfect. Yeah, it's a print history story as much as anything. I think that's fascinating. Trent, what about for you?
So I get asked a lot about the flat Earth movement. I think that's a very interesting sort of counter movement and attempt to kind of get back the older heavens in some form. I think maybe that's the most prominent example of many movements, most of which are more religiously based, but which I think are responding to the fact that the transformation of our cosmos, our heavens, has made the search for ultimate meaning and purpose a lot harder for a lot of people. And I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, a lot of things that are hard are good. But I think it has kind of taken away the easiest God, like the easiest heaven, the easiest explanation for why our short lives matter, the easiest moral framework for why our actions matter here on Earth. I think that framework has to do a lot with a sort of plausible, taken for granted marriage of the physical and the metaphysical. And as we kind of slowly, on average, divorce those 2 categories, it's made it harder to find that kind of ultimate meaning, not for everybody, but in particular for those people who are, I think, maybe less trained to kind of deal in abstractions and often less fortunate in this world. I think it's all, on one hand, there's like a loss of relevance of the heavens. On the other hand, I don't think we're even totally capable of forgetting the cosmic layout or forgetting our kind of background assumptions about where we are in the cosmos. And I think that does kind of shape, if not our conscious thought, then our sort of our attempt to find something transcendent in life.
Oh, that's just fantastic. And I'm going to turn it over to Angela to answer, to throw some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A at you. There's some really, really good ones. I know I could listen to you both talk all day and will be the first person on the list to buy your books when they came out, as hopefully lots of people in the audience are too. So thank you so much again to both of you. And Angela, I'll be excited to see which questions you toss their way.
Yes, I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A section. And so as you're listening to my announcements, I hope that everyone will take a look and put more questions in there. And you can always give a thumbs up to a question that you especially want answered. So just a couple of housekeeping things while everybody thinks about their questions. Our Centennial exhibit has opened as we celebrate the 100th anniversary. We are delighted to invite you to view this exhibit, Building on a Century of Collecting, at the Clements Library, which is available in person Monday through Friday from noon to 4 p.m. And you can also sign up for a guided tour on select dates. The exhibit builds on the landmark publication of the library's 75th anniversary, 101 Treasures from the Clements collection, from the collections of the William L. Clements Library. And we illustrate through a pairing with a new acquisition how these items that were already at the Clements can tell an even richer story of American life. You can also view the exhibit online, and it's actually an expanded exhibit online. So I hope everybody will also take a look at that. Speaking of the Centennial, our dedication happened on June 15th, 1923. So we think it's important to celebrate that day with an ice cream social. Plan to join us from 4 to 6 p.m. in front of the building on the plaza, and we'll have ice cream, games, activities, camaraderie. It should be fun, and no registration is needed for that event. Tell your friends. Rain or shine, we'll figure something out if it's raining, so come our way. We can't believe that Clayton Lewis will be leaving us at the end of June. So we hope that you'll also help us celebrate his retirement on June 20th from 5 to 7:30 at the Ann Arbor City Club. There will be food, drinks, a panel discussion. And so please register for that event and join us to wish Clayton well. And next month, on June 16th, we will welcome Tara Bynum to the Bookworm to discuss Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America, which tells the compelling stories of 4 early American writers who express their inner joy nourished by reading, despite living while enslaved or only nominally free. Everyone who's registered will receive a reminder for that Bookworm. And if you're unable to join us live, you'll still receive the email with the recording. Speaking of which, everyone will receive the email with the recording and resources mentioned today later this afternoon. And as always, if you're interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, you can contact me or Anne, and we'll be happy to help you with that. All right. So lots and lots of questions. I I was thinking, I noticed that there was a question about the opening, the prominent figure portrayed in the opening cartoon, and wondering maybe if you have more information, if that person's an African-American man. Oh, Trent, I think you're muted.
Sorry. So that opening cartoon is a satire of the Millerites, who, of course, believed that they were going to ascend to heaven simultaneously on a certain day in 1843, and then did not. I think the fact that there's a prominent African American in that cartoon is not an accident. Not because the Millerites attracted a lot of African American converts, but instead because already by the 1840s, there's a narrative that everything old and literal about the heavens is anti-progressive. And therefore, there was often an effort to associate everything about the kind of heaven that you could just ascend to on a certain day and, be there in a couple hours and lounge on a cloud. There's an effort to associate that with everybody that the kind of the dominant class associates with non-progressive backwardness. So that is to say that it's by no means is it African Americans alone, but it's, for example, Mormons are perhaps even more prominent. Catholics, of course, in the 1840s, to some extent, women as being sort of hysterical and more religious, and the list goes on and on. So the short answer is I do not think that's an accident.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought that was a particularly interesting question. This is really more one for the alums in the audience. Tom was thinking about Doc Losh and her Intro to Astronomy class, which at the University of Michigan is legend. So if I notice he's wondering if anybody had Doc Losh for astronomy. So I will just put that out there if anybody wants to comment in the chat. All right. So Cheryl's asking about Gates Ajar from 1868, Elizabeth Stuart Phelps' Vision of the Heaven, and wondering how that might fit into your research. I saw you both nodding, so maybe Carrie,
That was actually my question for Trent.
Oh, awesome.
So I'm glad that Cheryl came up with it as well. I was thinking that exact thing, because in Gates Ajar, it is a comforting heaven. It is the Victorian parlor up in the sky. And it's for, people are grieving. The character is grieving her brother who was killed in the Civil War. So this idea of a Victorian parlor up in heaven becomes a real site of comfort. I'd be fascinated to hear what you think. Oh, I think his signal might have frozen.
Oh, no. All right. Well, we'll hold until he reappears. And maybe in the meantime, Carrie, I know Kristen has a question about farmer almanacs, because whether or not they're also instructive and maybe even to present day.
Yeah. Absolutely. And a number of the almanacs contain the same tables. And I have this year's Farmer's Almanac, thanks to my mother. And yes, the tables are still there, lunation phases and all that. You may not see so much detail as you see in the 19th century, but you absolutely have the fundamentals of sunrise, sunset, and tides and lunation phases. So yeah, it's still there. Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, I think some of the things that you talked about with it sort of being under the radar now too, this helps us think more about places where we have seen it used recently. All right. How about,
I'm happy to, if you don't mind, could I jump in and answer Kristen Cabral's question about observatories? I
perfect.
don't know, Kristen, if I've just started reading The Heaven on Earth, which is the history of observatories, and in the 19th century. It's written by Charlotte Biggs and David Aubin, The Heavens on Earth. It's absolutely fascinating because early observatories on college campuses were built in the same building or adjacent to libraries. So the idea of books in the sky being connected architecturally as well as epistemologically, I think is quite significant. Also, I wanted to add my one gripe with the book is that there's no mention of Neptune, which was discovered in 1846. So that seems to be a bit of a hiccup, but it's an absolutely fascinating story. And also I would throw in, I'm intrigued by Bartlett, who wrote the textbooks in US military academies on optics and celestial navigation. So what is the relationship between the military and the stars and the use of the observatory at places like West Point?
Well, that is interesting. Thank you. I think Pat's question about the connection between Freemasonry and astrology, I think you had a slide where the Masons were mentioned, right?
Absolutely. And I didn't include a few pages of doodles by Dr. Bill, which included the Masonic eye that you see on the $1 bill. And Maggie, I don't know if you remember our tea time conversation, but it was precisely on the connection of Freemasonry and astrology. And I'm open to suggestions. My sense is that it was part of a subculture, that astrology was absolutely part of this kind of Masonry identification. You also see it in Carl Anderson, who was a very proud member of the Masonry. And so I think it's about decoding, decipherment, having a kind of hermeneutic language that you explore together, that creates a kind of community through a shared experience of decipherment and understanding of it. But Maggie, I don't know if you had some thoughts about that.
No, I do remember our tea time conversation though, and I think it's amazing that that does keep coming up, and that especially when it comes to military codes and flags and signals, that impulse to continually decode and reinterpret and reinscribe, I think is fascinating. And I also I think that actually ties in an interesting way to Elizabeth Collins' question about the extent to which grappling with astronomy and astrology is an attempt to feel okay with the concept of infinity and to figure out, systems for interpreting something that is sort of terrifying. And I wondered, I don't think I've had a chance to ask you this, but how does this story work in conversation with romanticism and the sublime, and like entering into this state of feeling awe and fear at infinity and expanse and whatever else? In your mind, is astrology, or I guess the 19th century return to it in some way, also an attempt to cope with feelings that the sublime brings on, or grasp that horror in a way that feels manageable and controllable? I think it's such a smart question, Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's such an evocative one. I think of Whitman and Journey Work of the Stars. The title of my book is taken from Leaves of Grass. And he says, Journey Work of the Stars, I won't recite it here, but a star is as significant as a blade of grass or the ants surrounding me. And Whitman takes the idea of infinity and boundlessness and the sublime and makes it comfortable, makes it part of a spiritual connection that, yes, it might be a mystery, but it's really a difference of scale. And those stars are as intimate in my world as this blade of grass. And we're all connected through this kind of spiritual connection between the planetary and the earthly. I was just reading Whitman's poem on composting, which is exactly the same thing, right? How what is seen as trash and toxic goes into the earth, and the earth purifies it in terms of new plants, new food, and growth. So he's really interested in patterns of regeneration, of recycling, and of correspondences, whether it's the planetary or the earthly. And I think it becomes part of his spiritual affinity and language. So it's sort of domesticating the sublime and making it part of an intimate universe, which I think Trent has written on in terms of the medieval worldview, was the idea of the dome. The sky is dome. The heavens were familiar, right? You could imagine them. And I think Whitman is trying to bring back that sense you can still feel at home in the world.
Yeah, and maybe right through some of the existential panic, that looking at the sky causes, that, hey, it's okay if you're just a really tiny little fragile creature whose existence is contingent, right? And I love when a little bit of that existential panic still comes through, especially as someone with a literary studies background. I love that your project also thinks really hard about the language that people have to use to make the case for this, right? And to justify it, and that it requires a different type of speaking about something that is so vast and unfamiliar, that I think just manifests differently, which is why I love the approach of your project too. Sorry, Angela, I didn't mean to commandeer the questions, but
That
really
was
good ones.
fascinating. Yeah, very good. Very good. Thank you. I love that. I noticed that there are several people asking variations on a question about how do other religions and values other than Christian contribute to the astrological paradigms in the 19th century, and how are they influencing Americans?
Yeah, is that Thomas Wagner's question?
Yes, Tom's question, as well as Kristen and Miriam, they all have variations on that.
Yeah, this is very much the issue right now. I was just listening to Robert Hand, one of the most respected astrologers, who's done a lot of archival research on Arabic and Mesopotamian and Latin and Greek astrological practices, as well as Vedic Indian astrology. Indian astrology is not on solar time, but on sidereal time. The moon sign is seen as more important than the sun sign. And so I think people who are interested in the history of astrology come into contact with other modalities of organizing time and mapping time. So you'll see this kind of cross-pollination through cultures. Through Robert Hand, he encountered Vedic astrology by visiting India, and it's through that experience that he started going into the archive and discovering this wealth of Arabic, Latin, and Greek ancient documents on astrology. So it's interesting how the geographic led to this kind of historical mining in the archive.
Welcome back, Trent. We were just talking about other religions and cultures, and how they influenced or used or saw astrological paradigms in the 19th century. So I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
No, nothing that Carrie wouldn't have already covered, I don't think. I'm so sorry about the dropped internet connection there. But I heard you do most of the question about Gates Ajar, which was really interesting to me. Gates Ajar was, I believe, maybe the second best-selling novel of the 19th century. It was post-Civil War, a book about heaven from a woman who lost her husband. It's really interesting. It's a big part of my story. I see it as kind of an early instance of a self-conscious revival of heavenly literalism, which is to say, as opposed to just sort of taking for granted a biblically literal heaven, a sort of conscious embrace of that heaven. But interestingly, the author of the book, Elizabeth Phelps, eventually backs off of her ultra-literal interpretation of a nearby heaven. And in the early, around 1904, she writes a piece saying, you know, while we educated people may not believe in this heaven, I do not regret having written my book because it's good for the common people. It's good for them to believe in this heaven. So that kind of, you know, that kind of attitude eventually percolates out and becomes kind of, you know, people who know believe this, but won't tell you they believe it, which is kind of poison to the old heavens. And that sort of attitude was common as sort of the ground shifted beneath the feet of more educated people in America.
Thank you. Thanks. So Carrie had said that that was one of the questions that she had been thinking about for you as well. Do you have any questions that you want to ask Carrie?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Carrie and I have never actually spoken directly about our projects. So, I mean, I have lots of questions. Just one that like randomly jumped into my head is, you know, I know that there was some pushback against the first almanacs that put forward a Copernican view of the cosmos, because I assume just because astrology sort of assumes a kind of human-centered cosmos, and like, you know, that the stars are important in no small part because of what they tell us about ourselves. I was curious, just sort of, if you've seen any evidence of that kind of pushback in the sources, or perhaps pushback against, like, you know, as T.J. Tomlin has written, you know, a lot of the editors of these almanacs would publish these prefaces being like, well, I don't believe any of this stuff. You know, all this astrology stuff is just for you farmers because you wouldn't buy my almanac if I didn't put it in here. So I'm curious if you've seen any pushback against the editors doing that, or boycotts of their almanacs or anything like that.
Oh, no, that's fascinating. It is an unabashedly geocentric practice, right?
Right.
The Earth is the center of the worldview. Where I do see that pushback is in pedagogical books, textbooks for young women on astronomy. So there's an early 19th century textbook for young women, and it says, astronomy is not astrology. That is the opening sentence of this textbook for women. And you can just tell, you know, doth protest too much. Obviously, they're all thinking this is precisely how you learn how to do astrology.
Right.
So the opening preface of this astronomy textbook is disavowing that and really pushing it away. And so what's interesting to me is with the professionalization of astronomy in the 19th century, it's often done by disassociating with astrology. Right. And that's how the professionalism is established. A lot like how doctors and gynecology was promoted at the expense of midwives. Right. So in the 19th century cult of the expert and the professionalization of these practices, it requires that you have to diss something and someone. And so for that, astrology was very much the foil to legitimate scientists as astronomers. But I'm finding that a number of astronomers crossed over and were able, because they were able to map and do the calculations and celestial navigation, they had all the skills to do precisely the nativities that I showed earlier. So a lot of them absolutely added the interpretive aspect of it, maybe not professionally, but they knew how. And that includes military figures as well.
Interesting.
That is interesting. And maybe in a weird way leads to Tom's question about the periodic recurrence of Halley's Comet portending disaster, because that's certainly a combination, right? I don't know if either of you have any comments on that.
Trent, did you want to?
Sure. Well, I'll just say, I mean, Halley's Comet is interesting
in itself, because because of its predictability. It puts to bed for a lot of people the idea that comments are these kind of periodic interruptions of what is otherwise a predictable cosmic order. So a lot of like the intense lay attention to comets, I think, has to do with the fact that people in their way don't just worship God or God in heaven, but they worship the kind of natural order that they see in the heavens, the apparent kind of pure perfection. There's never seems to be any like birth or death or decay in the heavens. They kind of worship that purity and order. And so I think when they see a comet, which appears like randomly to them, or a meteorite or anything like that, they think, well, this must be some kind of divine sign. God's trying to show me something. And as you get a kind of gradual popularization of the idea that some comets, most notably Halley's Comet, are in fact not random, it kind of adds to this sense that there's no point in seeing the cosmos as anything but like a giant clockwork.
And just if I could add a literary allusion to all that, Twain predicted, he was born with the arrival of Halley's Comet, and he said, "I will die when it arrives again," and he predicted his own death. But he also had a kind of portentous reading of solar eclipses. So in Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, there's a solar eclipse happening in this medieval moment. The king doesn't know what it means in terms of the astronomy, but he knows that solar eclipses bode very poorly for royalty and for leaders. It means an unsettling of your authority or a challenge to your authority. So Twain played with a number of astronomical figures in his writing.
Twain is so great on this topic. I mean, he's great on many topics, but he's so great on astronomy and astrology. And actually, one of the few parodies that he ever wrote that was too spicy even for his own taste was a parody of the kind of farmer view of heaven called Captain Stormfield's Voyage to Heaven, I think. Which he wrote in, I think, around 1890, but did not publish until his death in 1909 or something like that, until after his death. So.
Well, and didn't he, with 3,000 years among the microbes, where he's trying to create a micro, basically thought experiment of how humans should approach space colonization, but that, if I'm thinking about this correctly, that's one of his only totally unfinished novels, right? He couldn't get to an ending of it, which I think is perfectly appropriate, right? Like even grappling with that broke his story. It broke his paradigm and his format, which is just one of my favorite literary experiments ever. It's like, what is the ending? Who knows,
Right.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to end. So thank you so much, Carrie and Trent. This has been an amazing conversation. Maggie, thank you for your good questions and dialogue. And thank you to everybody who listened in and asked great questions. And we'll see you next month.
Great. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all. Thanks very much.